So I am Rachel Hubbard, and I'm the executive director at KOSU as of shortly before the pandemic, about 10 days before the pandemic started. And the last year has been a busy one, and one of uh, the partnerships that I am most proud of and the partnerships that I am most excited about the future of is with our guest tonight, Quraysh Ali Lansana. He is the executive producer of KOSU's newest show, Focus Black Oklahoma. Quraysh is also the author of 20 books in poetry, nonfiction, children's literature. He's currently a Tulsa Artist Fellow and serves as, you're not acting director, you're like real director now of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation at Oklahoma State University. Is that right?
I'll be real director as of June 1st.
Oh, okay. Close, like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
He's also the writer in residence for the Center for Poets and Writers and an adjunct professor in Africana Studies and English at OSU Tulsa. And as I said, the creator and executive producer of Focus Black Oklahoma, the new monthly show that we have on KOSU. It's also available wherever you get your podcasts. So Q, you're based in Tulsa. It's a busy time in Tulsa. There's a huge anniversary coming up in just a few days. So what are things, I was there with you just a few weeks ago. What are things like on the ground in Tulsa in the Greenwood district right now?
Well, thank you again, Rachel, for having me. And it's a pleasure to work with you and to be a part of the KOSU family. The centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is quickly approaching. May 31st to June 1st, but events and programming will actually begin as early as the 26th and go on through the first week of June and actually on the way through Juneteenth. And so we are in Tulsa still anticipating, even during the midst of this pandemic, though things are better in some ways, we're still expecting an influx of about 25,000 people. Mostly from folks out of state coming in for the events of the observance. And so right now, the district is in fast preparation mode. So Vernon AME is putting some touches on the paints and on the paintings and sort of refurbishing the building and the sidewalk at the Greenwood Cultural Center across the street. They are repairing the wonderful memorial. And the light on that memorial, actually it's not a light, it's a flame, has been out for some time. So they're repairing that memorial, also doing some work inside the center as well, from what I understand. Their streets are being repaired, Greenwood Avenue, also Archer Avenue at that corner is also a great deal of street construction happening. Of course, Greenwood Rising, the new History Center Museum, is still under construction rapidly. I know the commission, the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, had a goal of the museum being open at least for some invited members of the public for the Centennial weekend. That looks like that's a long way off from where I sit right now, but I'm not in the construction business, so we'll see how quickly they can turn that around. But they've been working rapidly and almost around the clock. So in addition to all of that, there's gentrification. There are many buildings that are being constructed in the district, from corporate business offices to apartment complexes, or condos, I should say, probably more appropriately. And so the streets are bustling right now, mostly with preparation and construction. And every now and again, the tourists are starting to trickle in, but I would say certainly by the last week, the beginning of the last week of this month, we will receive this influx of folks who are coming to observe the centennial.
So let's talk about what we know inside KOSU as FBO, but probably more commonly known to the people who are tuning in tonight as Focus Black Oklahoma. So you're an Oklahoma native, grew up in Enid. Tell us, but you spent quite a bit of time in Chicago and New York and have returned home permanently to Oklahoma, and you noticed something when you got here that really inspired you to create FBO. So what is it that you noticed? Why did you decide that this show was something you had to do?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, yes, I grew up in Enid. I went to OU and studied journalism at OU in the early 80s. Worked for a bit at Channel 9 before leaving for Chicago, where I lived for 29 years and 2 years in Brooklyn. So being away from the state for 31 years total. Um, and I grew up watching Saturday Review. I grew up watching Mr. Ben Tipton, may he rest in peace. Um, Host the Saturday Review, which was a show on KOCO Channel 5 in Oklahoma City, which was a show about Black issues and issues affecting Black Oklahomans, but also issues more broadly affecting the Black community nationally. And that show was always, I didn't watch it, very often. I was still young, but I that show went off the air in '89, which was the year after I moved to, well, actually the year I did move to Chicago. So I was always paying attention to it as a young adult, but I definitely grew up with it as a child. And certainly after I knew I sort of had got this journalism bug, which was in middle school. Um, and the fact that that show existed really informed me in terms of the idea that the issues affecting Black folks in the state was important enough that it actually got weekly airtime outside of the daily local news outlets, which more often than not, BIPOC people were represented negatively on the 5, 6, and 10 o'clock news. And so Saturday Review was a refreshing sort of informational and intellectual um, foundation for me as a young man growing up in Enid and as a young journalist at OU. And so when I returned to Oklahoma in 2018, I did some market research and could not find anything on mainstream media in Oklahoma City or in Tulsa that um, was doing the kind of show that was um, like what Ben Tipton did with Saturday Review. At least on mainstream media. I know about Mr. Perry and Perry Broadcasting, and they have a talk radio element as well, where issues are discussed. And I learned of another show out of Tulsa um, that was on the air at least for some time, and Mr. Anderson, I believe, for some time um, during that 30-year span that I was away. But upon my return, I could find really not much of anything on mainstream media that was about issues relevant to the Black community. And so I reached out to my old friend, former OU grad as well, Scott Gregory, who is a senior producer at KWGS 89.5 here in Tulsa. And I mean, very early on, upon my return to Oklahoma, maybe within the first week or two, Scott and I sat down and had Mexican food. And I said, is there anything like this on the radio? He said, not to my knowledge. I said, is there anything like this on TV? He said, not to my knowledge. I said, okay, well, this is something that I'd like to do. Would you be interested in being a part of helping to make this happen? And he said, sure. So, I went to work. I put some ideas down on paper, some framework, a pitch for the show. I again still very young in Tulsa, but I connected with some folks that I had met who suggested other folks that they knew who might be interested in helping make this happen. And then so this would have been say August of 2018 through I don't know the end of that year. And so in January 2019, I was invited to become a Tulsa Artist Fellow. And the director of the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, Carolyn Sickles, we sat down over coffee, and she said, what are the ideas that you have? What sort of projects are you working on? And I mentioned Focus Black Oklahoma in addition to a few other things. And she said, that's the one. And so um, as of January 2019, I became officially a fellow. and began to use some of my stipend money, some of my programming money to start to produce a pilot and to pull folks together. We spent 2 weekends auditioning folks. I was amazed that, there were 2 weekends, and probably from 10 to 6, 10 to 7 on 2 different weekends, 2 Saturdays, 2 Sundays. I mean, the slots were filled. And so we found some co-hosts. We found and a backup co-host. Folks were interested in being correspondents, and we put together our first pilot. I want to say by um, June, July of 2019. um, and then and sent that over to Rich Fisher, KWGS, and then started working on a second pilot after some critique from Rich and others. Worked on some tweaks, and then the first broadcast aired. The first broadcast of FBO aired in January of 2020. And so we were able to turn it around from concept and idea to pilot to broadcast in a little over a year. Um, and and then of course the pandemic hit. So we got about 2 shows in before we had to shut down operations with KWGS. But we are very, very happy to be working with KOSU, and to fill this void that that I believe exists, right? That more times than not, when Black and brown folks are on mainstream media, it is about something that's not necessarily negative, that's not so it doesn't shed a positive life on BIPOC people or the BIPOC communities. And every community of every ethnicity has its positives and its negatives. And more often than not, I see and hear only negative things about the BIPOC community in Oklahoma. We wanted to change that. That there are stories that don't often make mainstream media, from communities of color, um, that celebrate life and are social justice and are doing good things in the community, like I say, doing good in the hood, as well as other issues that are specific to BIPOC communities, that don't that don't get as bright of a spotlight shined on those issues. Like, for example, the fact that the mortality rate between North Tulsans, which is a primarily Black community, and South Tulsans is 11 years, right? There's an 11-year difference. Um, South Tulsans live 11 years longer than North Tulsans. North Tulsans, again, are predominantly Black. It's a food desert. There's no hospital. And so those are the sorts of issues that we shine a light on, in addition to the positive and humorous aspects of life, BIPOC life in Oklahoma. And I didn't see that anywhere on mainstream media, radio, or television. Certainly some online newspapers, and certainly the Oklahoma Eagle, but and the Black Wall Street Times, but not the news stations, the local TV news stations, and really not much in terms of the radio.
So there are two things that I just want to point out that I love about FBO's producers and the philosophy of the show that I just want KOSU listeners to know as we kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit. One is that none of these people, really, very few of them, come with any journalism background or journalism experience. So they are reporting from their lived experience, which I believe brings a much richer version of the story, or any story. Because I think that you can build rapport with people that you're talking to. And the philosophy is really that the reporters come alongside someone and tell their story as a peer. And that is a real paradigm shift in journalism as a whole. Q, you and I have talked about this, especially when we did the Solutions Journalism Network series, that when we were reflecting on it, is that you really wanted to make sure that we were coming alongside people who were experiencing homelessness from a peer perspective, and not that we were doing them a favor by telling them their story. And I don't necessarily think it's malicious or intentional, but that has historically been the paradigm of journalism. And so that's so much of what the FBO correspondents, both existing and the new ones that are joining the show right now, bring to this, is that they are citizen journalists who are reporting as peers. So the next episode is on Sunday. What can we expect in this week's episode?
Well, you can expect a spotlight on the Green Pastures production studio, which is, Oklahoma has become a hub for motion pictures, in terms of shooting motion pictures in the country. It's almost a little LA in some ways. It's becoming that way. There are 12 different ecosystems in Oklahoma, which make it a great place to find different regions, different terrains, have different feels to shoot films. So we take a look at Oklahoma's new sort of stature in the film industry. We also visit with the folks from the University of Tulsa who have started a legal clinic in North Tulsa for North Tulsa residents, which is the first of its kind. It's a very positive thing that the TU has decided to branch out and create this clinic in North Tulsa, and because now North Tulsa residents, who again are primarily Black, have access to some place for guidance, for help, for to answer questions, for instructions on how to do, or information on how to address this issue or that issue. And it's in their own community. It's in their own neighborhood. They don't have to go down the street to the university campus. So that's one of our a story in the upcoming broadcast. Bracken Clark, one of our associate producers, sits down with Representative Maury Turner from Oklahoma, not from Oklahoma City, from Ardmore, but in Oklahoma City, to discuss what they are doing, what's important to them in their role in the State House of Representatives, and the kinds of battles or microaggressions that they have had to endure as a same-sex loving Muslim brown-skinned woman in the State House of Representatives in the state of Oklahoma. So that's a very interesting piece as well. We also spend, and I'm excited about this as an author, as a writer, we have 3 book-related stories in the upcoming episode. One is an interview with Jewel Parker Rhodes, Dr. Jewel Parker Rhodes, who is the author of the novel Magic City, which is the first novel, or I should say the oldest novel, or the first novel, you put it that way, written about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Her book came out sometime in the early 90s, and HarperCollins has reissued that book for the Centennial. And so Onika Asamoah Caesar, who's the owner of Fulton Street Books, our Black-owned bookstore in Tulsa, sat down with Dr. Rhodes, and it's a very, very interesting story as about how she's not from Oklahoma, how she came to this knowledge about what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago, and some of the things that drove the novel. We also, as one of the next gen stories from our correspondent Crystal Patrick, she spoke with Carlos Moreno, who also has a book coming out, or actually it's out now, called The Victory of Greenwood. And it is really a very, very well-researched and comprehensive study of the people who built the district, and from 1905 to 1921 and its destruction. Deep biographies, interviews with survivors, with descendants of survivors, even also exploring what happened in what I call the 3, or what's happened in the wake of what I call the 3 reawakenings of the district: 1922, 1940, 41, and then after the highway and the whole Model Cities project came through and cut the neighborhood in half, and cut it off from the city in the late 60s. So Carlos's book is very researched, very comprehensive, and we're excited to showcase him, and he's a local author as well. And then we also have a review of a book called The Three Mothers, and that is a book about the mothers of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, and Malcolm X. And it's a fascinating fascinating study into the lives of three women who were the mothers of three very, very significant men in terms of civil rights and social justice, but whose stories were untold. And even as G. Vickers, who did the review, mentions in the story, in her review, that even getting any information about these three women, these three mothers, was largely based on when their sons referenced them. So, you know, it's another story of really of misogyny, of chauvinism, of sexism, almost a kind of putting under the rug the histories of these women who were responsible for these three important men. So that's there's more, but you know, I don't want to give all of it away. So please tune in.
So I want to get through a couple of sort of reveal items that we have here, and then we're going to get to, we've had a number of listener questions in advance. If you do have questions, feel free to type those either in the chat window or the Q&A box, or, you know, always feel free to contact us with story ideas, because Focus Black Oklahoma is a form of citizen journalism. And so both FBO and KOSU were always interested in your story ideas, so make sure to put those in there. So the first thing I want to talk about is Opal's Greenwood Oasis. This is a book that you co-wrote with Naja Amatullah Hilton, who is a middle school or high school English teacher,
Middle school
English teacher in Oklahoma City, well, on the northeast side of Oklahoma City. And she co-wrote this book with you. So I'm going to stop and share my screen while you tell us a little bit about the book, and then I'll ask you to read a couple pages of it.
Sure. So as I may have mentioned earlier, I've been researching the district, the Greenwood district, and the massacre for almost 20 years, with the intention of always creating projects, books for the Centennial. And as an educator, as somebody who has worked in K-12 education for decades as a teaching artist, in addition to my work in higher ed, what I wanted to make sure that young people had a way to enter this history and to understand the Black excellence over Black pain that was Greenwood, that was the district, that was one of the most, if not the most economically vibrant, economically affluent Black communities in the world, and certainly in the country for a time. And because all of us who attended K-12 education in Oklahoma, none of us were taught any of this history, right? And at least not formally in Oklahoma history classes. So, and the fact that this state the state and the city of Tulsa made a concerted effort to bury this history, and almost did successfully, you know, for almost a century, made it even more so of a compelling notion in my mind that I really wanted young people to experience the district in its glory, experience the district in its prime, that it was a safe community, a nurturing community. Sure, it had its red lights district, but it also had its mansions on it, literally on the hill. It had an upper class and a middle class and a working class and a lower working class. And it was a place where folks were safe, and that it was a place where Black folks felt safe in their community. And it was a place that evolved in the face of some of the most severe Jim Crow laws and racism in the country. And that it was built by Black hands, and that it thrived. And it thrived until it was destroyed due to economic jealousy and severe racism. And so a part of it, again, for me is, you know, if, you know, I spent a lot of time, I lived for a long time on the south side of Chicago. I've taught on the south side and the west side of Chicago, as well as in higher ed, in different schools in Chicago. And one of the things that I've often thought about, right, particularly working with young people, is if all you can see is your block, can you see beyond your block, right? Do you have the vision, the wherewithal? Do you have the support to see beyond your block? or to dream beyond your immediate circumstance. And what I wanted to do with this book is to think about the North Tulsa, the kids in North Tulsa, the kids on the south and west sides of Chicago, the kids on the northeast sides of Oklahoma City, the kids in the hoods all over the country, to say, look, this is what Black folks did in North Tulsa 100 years ago, and this is in your DNA. You have the ability to dream this because folks before you did and built it. So you can do this too. But first, you have to see what it was before it became what you see now, as a way to help, again, see beyond the block. And so that was a very, very important factor for me and for Naja as well, and for our illustrator Skip Hill, in terms of the book. We also, intentionally wanted to have a girl forward focus. We wanted the lead character to be a girl child, and because there are more lead characters of children's books that are animals than are children of color, right? And that is, you can go look that up, listeners. That is a real fact. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a girl forward focus in this book, and that we showed the district again in its prime, in its heyday, what it was. There had to have been something there before it was destroyed, and there was 36 to 40 blocks of Black-owned homes and businesses and banks and churches and schools, where a dollar would start at the corner of Archer and Greenwood at Sunrise, and that same dollar will end up back at the corner of Greenwood, Archer, and Sunset, and be exchanged by 12 to 18 pairs of Black hands for that entire span. That kind of economic power and might, that kind of community, which I think is, she rides her bicycle. Opal takes us on a bike ride through the district, and and it's her first solo bike ride to run an errand for her mother, to get cinnamon for the pies for the Memorial Day or Decoration Day picnic. And I think that that first solo bike ride is universal. It's something that I think all of us can sort of connect to or relate to. And when Opal takes us on this bike ride to Mr. Mann's store, she's taking us through this community, and you get to experience through Skip's amazing illustrations how vibrant, how much life the district really held, and the district really was before its destruction, before its demise.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful book, and just a reminder that with this book, I think through the summer, the end of our KOSU's end of fiscal year membership drive, this is a thank you gift that we've been offering. You can also, get the book wherever you, if you want to support a local bookstore, then, we also endorse supporting local businesses,
Right.
but you can get it as a thank you gift when you give to KOSU. So the other thing that I want to stop, this is I know that you don't like surprises in live events, Q.
Uh-oh, what are you doing?
Oh, so since I talked to you this afternoon, I have the first publicly releasable audio clip. So this is a project that we have been working on, that we're going to officially announce during this event. So Q, when we started talking about FBO, you said, hey, there's this podcast I really, really want to do. Other people are working on things around Greenwood, around the Race Massacre anniversary, and there really isn't anyone from Oklahoma telling this story. There are all sorts of people, Russell Westbrook, LeBron James, all sorts of people coming from outside to tell the Greenwood story. But I have this pitch for a podcast that I think that we should do. And so we talked, and it was like, we don't have the capacity to bring this level with all of the other things that you were doing surrounding this anniversary, and KOSU's capacity to produce something in the way that we really felt like it needed to be produced. So we contacted longtime collaborators at WNYC in New York City, And they said, hey, we would like to bring in our collaborator History Channel. And so on May 28th, KOSU, Focus Black Oklahoma, WNYC Studios, and History Channel will be releasing the second season of Blind Spot. This season is called Blind Spot Tulsa Burning. And I have the rough cut of the podcast trailer that I'm going to play. And then we'll get a Q's reaction on the other side, I guess. After you told me that you didn't like surprises in live events. I'm sorry. So we still need to do some crediting language changes to include Focus Black Oklahoma in there. I think there was something missing in the script, but that's the rough cut. And
Couldn't hear it though.
You couldn't hear it?
No.
Yeah. You should have told me. What do I do?
I was sending you a message.
Oh no, I couldn't see it because I was sharing. Oh, all right. Share sound. I'm sorry. I'm a terrible person. What a letdown. Okay, let me try it again. Can you hear it now? Oh, okay. Let's try again. Sorry. This is like live radio at its worst.
I want to take you back.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank God. I'm trying to total moron.
I want to take you back 100 years ago. It's the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
You'll feel like you walked into a 1921 version of Wakanda and all is vibranium.
Some people called it Black Wall Street.
A dollar bill could start at sunrise and be exchanged only by black hands. We can't do that now.
And then came the massacre.
People want to say, oh, it was the Klan and this mob violence. No, it was the police department. It was the city of Tulsa.
This was the largest race massacre since the Civil War.
I'm Kalalia. Blind Spot, Tulsa Burning is the story of a community set on fire and how a century later, the residents are still rebuilding.
I refuse to stand by and allow lies to be told.
From the History Channel and WNYC Studios, in collaboration with KOSU in Oklahoma. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, that was chilling.
Wasn't it?
That was great. It's always wonderful to see an idea, to hear an idea come to fruition from infancy to legs to walking. That's exciting. That's exciting.
I know. I was like, should I share it with him in advance or should I watch his reaction in real time after he told me he hates surprises in live events? So I apologize.
That was a great surprise though.
Okay.
You're forgiven for this.
Okay,
one.
Good.
Yeah, no, that sounded great. Are they starting to promote it already too?
We should get the promotional materials maybe tomorrow.
Okay.
They're going through the final legal things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna make sure they add Focus Black Oklahoma to that.
Yes. So
are you on top of that
I'm
already?
on top of it. Already on top of it.
Very good. Well, that is exciting. And it's, I think, again, sort of where we were in the conversation prior to that moment is because this history was buried, I didn't personally learn about the massacre formally until I moved to Chicago in 1989. I was 25 years old, and I went through K-12 education in Enid, Oklahoma. And I had heard some tellings about it from older adults or whatnot, but nothing in a formal kind of setting to understand the significance of the district, let alone the enormity of the massacre. And so I'm 25 years of age, freshly in Chicago, and I go to a meeting of the National Black United Front, led by a brilliant man, a brilliant scholar, named Dr. Conrad Worrell. May he rest in peace. And so I'm new. I mean, I'm literally just a couple months in, a major city, Chicago, Illinois, and I go to this meeting of this organization, and I introduce myself and they want to know what I've done, what I can do, what kind of gifts I can bring to the organization. And I tell them I'm a journalist, and I just moved here from Oklahoma. And Dr. Worrell said, "Oh, well, you must know about the Tulsa Race Massacre." And I was embarrassed, and I didn't go back because I was embarrassed that I didn't have this knowledge, which was the immature thing to do. But from that moment on, I made it a mission to find out about the district as well as the massacre. And that's really what started my deep dive into the research. And I only paused a few times to do things like, get through tenure, and and run the Centennial celebration for my mentor, the late Miss Gwendolyn Brooks. But otherwise, I was flying back to Tulsa a couple times a year and spending time at the Harsh Collection of the Library of the South Side of Chicago, which would sort of be Chicago's equivalent to the Schomburg, to find out what I could. I still have a Chicago library book. My copy of Reconstructing the Dreamland is a Chicago library book. So, but yeah, that's how I found this knowledge. And, ever since then, I couldn't let it go, wouldn't let me go. But the fact that there were folks outside of the state that were aware of this atrocity, maybe even in many ways more aware of it than folks inside the state, again by design, is disturbing. But that's likely the truth.
So I want to stop here because we've gotten a number of questions in advance of tonight's event, and most of them, if you could just draw a line through them, surround House Bill 1775 that the governor signed into law this week. And many people want to know what your thoughts are on this bill and and the discussion that is currently happening in the state of Oklahoma.
Sure. Well, 1775 is largely focused on what is called critical race theory, but also, in addition to that, also no longer requires mandatory diversity and equity training, and no longer requires mandatory sexual harassment training, which all of the above are problematic. But let's start with the critical race theory part of this, because for some reason, some folks are sort of scared of that phrase, like it's the boogeyman or something. And what critical race theory really means is simply this, just to break it down in sort of simple terms, is that racism and white supremacy have been, that are a part of the laws and the landscape that make up the governance of this country. And I don't know how anyone could argue that is not true, right? The fact that just recently, I think a Virginia legislator said we should bring back the 3/5 compromise, which was in the Constitution, that Black folks were 3/5 of a human to count for voting. Which, think about that in relationship to what's happening now in terms of the redistricting and the bills that have passed regarding the suppression of the vote, particularly for folks of color and poor people. But that the idea of critical race theory is that Yes, there have been laws. I mean, Jim Crow, which we've talked about earlier, were laws of this country that dictated where Black people could go, where they could work, when they had to be home. In Henrietta, Oklahoma, and other places, they were sundown towns. So there were signs that said Black, Negro, or actually a less nice word, be home before dark. That's legislated. Those are legislated acts of racial bias, or racial bias that's been turned into law, right? The first piece of legislation in the history of this state, Senate Bill number 1, makes Oklahoma a Jim Crow state in defiance of the president, in defiance of Teddy Roosevelt, right? And so what critical race theory says is that critical race theory acknowledges that. And then in the acknowledgement of those truths, which I don't know how anyone could argue that. Also, in the acknowledgement of those truths, also says the effects of those laws, even though they're no longer, in most places, in most accounts, they're no longer the laws of the land, but the effects, the residuals of those laws, the damage that those laws inflicted, not just on Black folks and folks of color, but the damage of white supremacy that white folks carry, that those things still exist. And until we as a society engage in acknowledging, 1, white supremacy is real, 2, that legislated racism continues to have and play a role in the way people live today, even though those laws are no longer on the books formally. And 3, acknowledging that those two things exist and impact how we interact with one another, how we're governed, how we're policed. The fact, as I said a moment ago, that North Tulsa is a food desert, and that there's not a hospital in North Tulsa, just speaks very much to the idea. Okay, so House Bill 1775 would say, I, Quraysh Ali Lansana, can't acknowledge that there's not a hospital in North Tulsa, or that North Tulsa is a food desert, because that would imply that the reasons why North Tulsa is a food desert and there's no hospital is because of white supremacy. And the truth of the matter is that that's exactly why there's not a hospital, or that North Tulsa is a food desert. But House Bill 1775 says that I can't say that, and I can't teach it in my classes at OSU. And that only privileges one viewpoint, and that viewpoint, that vantage point, that perspective is the same perspective that any of us who've been through K-12 education in this country already know, which is just quite plain and simply the white male lens on history, right? There's no way, like one of my favorite quotes, and you've heard me say this many times, Rachel, which I think really sums this whole situation up with 1775, is from Miss Clara Looper, Oklahoma's greatest civil rights leader. And she said in 2016 for the Associated Press, she said, my biggest job now is helping white people understand that Black history is white history. We cannot separate the two, right? There's a Greenwood district, but there's no Greenwood district without Jim Crow laws, right? There's no massacre. There's no destruction of the Greenwood district without there being a Greenwood district and there being white folks involved in being economically jealous and racist and destroying it. That's all of us together. It's not just, the massacre is not just Black history. It's not just Black Tulsa history. It's Tulsa history, and it's national history. It's American history. And because we didn't go out and burn our own buildings down, right? So, and that's what's so, no one say crazy, that's not the right word. So what's so disarming or disturbing about 1775 is that it suggests that, in using the massacre itself again as a paradigm, and going back to Miss Looper's quote, that we just burn our own stuff down. So because the white folks were mad at us, so we just decided to go burn our own stuff down. No, that's not how that happened, right? That's not what happened. So does that put, I know another part of 1775 is, that it's destroying our white males, that white men are, shouldn't be put upon for the past. Well, it were largely white men who destroyed the district. And so your history is intertwined with my history. Therefore, it's our history. But 1775 says, no, you can't teach my part of it. Right.
And the thing that's
just stick to your part.
Yeah, the thing
Go
that's
ahead.
so weird about that, you and I listened to a chunk of that debate simultaneously, and we were talking about it as it was happening. And I think that there were two things in the question and answer session and the debate that were very striking. And in some of the legislative observers that we have since talked to, and some of the people from the State Department of Ed that we've since talked to, is, we know a couple of implications. Oklahoma State University has already released a statement saying, we hope that you will continue to take part in sexual harassment training and diversity training. However, it is no longer mandatory. So that's like the first thing that we've seen that is, an actual concrete piece of, or a concrete response to this legislation. But the reality is that there are no rules that have been constructed. This bill tasks the State Department of Education with creating a set of rules. It's unclear what the objective measure of people's feelings will be. And a number of educators seem very scared that if they do continue to teach and a child feels badly about the lesson, then what happens next? And what's the objective measure? And so I think that from the observers that we have talked to, that's where a lot of the confusion lies. And many people believe strongly that this will just end up in a court battle somewhere in the probably not too distant future.
Probably so, because I don't know. I know very few of my colleagues at OSU for sure, or at OU, or any of my colleagues. I mean, I haven't talked to everyone, but I know my colleagues at OSU and OU aren't planning on changing their lesson plans or changing their syllabi. So it will be interesting to see how they decide to try and roll this out or enforce this. I was happily surprised to see the Centennial Commission come out with a statement. Some of my colleagues and I are planning to draft a statement as well. I know the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Center drafted and has posted a statement as well. And all of us feel, I think all of these entities really feeling like, particularly this year, in the year of the Centennial, and the year of one of the most significant acts of racial violence in American history that occurred in this state, with Governor Stitt on that Centennial Commission, right? That how tone deaf, what are you thinking? How tone deaf must you be to be able to sit on this commission about this atrocity and say, but you really can only teach the part about the fact that you built these businesses, Black folks built these businesses and then they were destroyed. Like, that's only half the story. That's not the full story. That's not truth, right? And as a professor, as educators, we're engaged in truth, right? Most of us, unless you have an agenda, we're engaged in trying to teach what I call real history, which is to be inclusive of everyone, every ethnicity, every gender, every sexual orientation involved in a moment, the moment that's being taught, and involve all of those folks or those entities with equal time, with equal depth. And that's what 1775 does, is completely counterintuitive to that kind of rationale.
Well, Q, I know that you have another event to go to tonight, so we're going to wrap this up. But thank you so much to everybody for joining us tonight. If you have story ideas or questions for Q that you would like to ask after this event, obviously do that, especially if if you happen to be watching this later. If you have things that you want to tell us, we always welcome those. Public radio is, in its very nature, a collaborative venture, and we appreciate each and every one of you in whatever part it is that you are doing. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Remember that we are also funded by the public, which means you. So if you have not yet given a gift to KOSU, we really appreciate it. It's so meaningful to work creating shows like Focus Black Oklahoma and allowing us to do the experimentation and inviting people of all walks of life in with open arms as producers on the station. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. If you can't find Blind Spot Tulsa Burning, the podcast, or Focus Black Oklahoma, the podcast, please let us know. If you do listen to those as podcasts, we encourage you to review them because that helps boost us in the ratings. So thank you so much for doing that if you listen to either of those shows. If you have trouble finding them on Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever it is that you get your podcasts, let us know and we'll help you out with that. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight, and we'll let you go.